Good morning. Thanks for those who just joined. Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. Good morning. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Melissa Romero. I'm with California Environmental Voters, and I want to welcome you to the third webinar of a six-part webinar series organized by California Environmental Voters, Project 2030, and the Climate Center. And in case you missed the first two webinars, the first on the science behind carbon dioxide removal, and the second on the different technologies and also methods that are also underneath the carbon dioxide removal umbrella, we will be dropping the link to where you can find the last two webinar recordings so that you can catch up. So on today's webinar, which is the third of the series, so we're halfway through, we'll be talking about the health and safety concerns and questions with carbon dioxide removal, lessons learned from other states, and some more details on public health and safety concerns around the transportation and storage of carbon dioxide. We want to acknowledge that there are widespread concerns and questions around the technological side of carbon dioxide removal. In particular, there are some serious concerns around the bioenergy side of technological carbon dioxide removal because of the local air pollution associated with these types of projects. So for those of you who are legislative staff listening in, we want you to know that there are many community-based groups in California who have very specific policy priorities. It is essential that you work directly with organizations who represent communities where many of these projects are being cited in or proposed in if carbon dioxide removal comes up in legislation. There is so much information to cover and talk about on the broad topic of carbon dioxide removal. And in the first two webinars, we've already covered what scientists are saying, what different methods are from the nature-based to the hybrid to the technological. And today we're focusing in on part one of a two-part of community concerns, including around the implications of the transportation and storage of CO2, which does come along with the technological side of carbon dioxide removal, and how that's playing out around the country and in California, lessons learned, and potential safeguards that can protect communities. I also want to acknowledge the elephant in the room, the deep concerns that many of us have about the next presidential administration's deregulation, anti-climate agenda, and how that will impact federal policies and protections related to carbon dioxide removal. So the role of state regulations and protections for communities just got that much more important. So really important that you all are here, and thank you so much. So let's go to the next slide. I want to just start off by talking about why we are here talking about carbon dioxide removal. And you can go ahead and click through until the 3 bullet points are up. There, thank you. So 6 years ago, the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, gave us a prescription on what we have to do to avoid climate catastrophe. So we have to cut emissions in half by 2030 and draw down 100 to 1,000 gigatons of CO2. And the IPCC considers carbon removal, meaning removal of carbon that's already in the atmosphere, as inevitable to meet our Paris Agreement goals. And additionally, California passed AB 1279 in 2022, which set a state goal of reaching carbon neutrality by 2045, with at least 85% from emissions reductions. Therefore, up to 15% from carbon dioxide removal to meet that net zero goal. California has also set a goal for carbon dioxide removal in the 2022 scoping plan. Next slide. So California-based projects have received 4 grants from the Department of Energy's Direct Air Capture Hubs program. And some projects are already going through the permitting process. And since there are many CDR projects that are being proposed and permitted in California, communities must have a critical role in and how these projects get developed. Many of the carbon dioxide removal pathways provide necessary co-benefits for adaptation, like biodiversity, food and water security, clean air and water, and more. We can go to the next slide. So I want to just share with you all the context behind the three organizations who put this together and how we look at this issue. What are our shared principles around carbon dioxide removal? So our three organizations, California Environmental Voters, Project 2030, and the Climate Center, have developed these shared principles while we all learn together about carbon dioxide removal and the kinds of things that are going to be happening. So the first is that we believe removing past climate pollution from the atmosphere is essential to stabilizing the climate. The second is that we must rapidly accelerate cutting of GHG emissions and phasing out of fossil fuels. Third is CDR is not a substitute for direct emissions reductions and is very distinct from carbon capture and storage, which is a technology that aims to capture carbon at the point source before it's emitted into the atmosphere. We're talking sort of rather about removing existing atmospheric carbon. That's what we're talking about today. Carbon dioxide removal projects should be community-centered and designed with input from communities. These projects should prove that they are not exacerbating any existing environmental problems. And finally, the role of nature-based carbon dioxide removal is critical with its many co-benefits. So now that we've set the context, I want to share a few more notes before we dive in to the next slide. We're going to hear from we're missing out on one speaker, Jack from Mississippi Emergency Management Agency, who unfortunately at the last minute could not make it. But we're really grateful for our four other speakers. We'll have time for Q&A from the audience at the end. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom and not the chat so we can make sure to see your questions and capture them. This will make our job of getting all the questions a lot easier, and we can use the chat for sharing resources and comments. And additionally, please look out for the invite for the next webinar. We can go to the next slide, which is going to be the part 2 on communities and carbon dioxide removal, on oversight, governance, and community benefits. Date will be announced later, but if you registered today, you will get the invitation to register. So let's go to our first speaker, Elena.
Hey everyone. My name is Elena Chuney, and I am the interim director at Carbon 180. Interim director of our environmental justice team at Carbon 180. And Carbon 180 is a nonprofit organization that focuses on removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And we do that by working with policymakers, peer nonprofit organizations, and communities to make sure that equity and justice are at the forefront of our work. So now I'm going to share my screen. Okay, today I am going to be talking about communities in CDR. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes grounding today's conversation on how we can learn from the past while planning for a future that has a just and equitable carbon removal field by simply investing in communities. So for those of you less familiar with Carbon 180 and our regranting efforts, in 2021, we were giving funding to support environmental justice organizations in learning about carbon removal and helping Carbon 180 define what we mean by equitable and just carbon removal. Our goal was to give these organizations the opportunity to create their own informed opinions regarding carbon removal so that they could ultimately determine whether it was aligned with their mission and vision, to determine if or how their communities would meaningfully contribute to policy to shape the future of carbon removal, and to help our organization fully integrate environmental justice considerations into carbon removal policy. Carbon 180 understood very early on that funding was crucial for not just bringing advocates to the table, but for supporting them in leading the conversation around equitable and just carbon removal. So in 2022, we officially launched our Environmental Justice Regranting Initiative, providing $1.2 million to 3 EJ organizations over the course of 2 years. Through this work, the regrantees participated in a carbon removal curriculum led by Carbon 180, to deepen their technical knowledge about carbon removal solutions, both the knowns and unknowns. And we provided them with digestible educational material and resources for the organizations to develop organizational positions on what they thought about carbon removal and to ultimately share those resources with their community. So at the conclusion of the curriculum sessions, we then worked with each organization to help them create proposals for carbon removal projects in their area. The goal of requiring the organizations to think about a carbon removal project was to move them from an educational understanding, so like this is what we see on paper, this is all the science behind it, to a more, this is how you execute it, and to allow them to determine ways for how they wanted their community to advocate for the role that carbon removal would play in their community. And to be very clear, it may very well be that carbon removal should play no role at all. So what you see on this slide and the next are CDR projects created and executed by the community. Air Alliance Houston was one of our EJ organizations in our first cohort, and they are located in Texas. Their project looked at the qualitative assessment and possible path forward. So it looked at carbon capture and what was happening there and what went wrong, and how carbon removal could be a different alternative and could be done in a way that centered community. Appalachian Voices took a completely different route and decided to do a land-based carbon removal project. And for them, they had a lot of mine lands that need to, like mine land reclamation. There were so many mine lands that were abandoned, and they were like, how do we restore the land? So for them, they were like, what does it look like to do forestry CDR on old mine lands and to use those trees for carbon removal? And then we have Black Millennial for Flints. Also, they were continuing to work towards equitable CDR. So this is our current cohort, and they are at the very early stages of their project development. But what we are seeing is as the organizations progress in the regranting cohort, they have more questions, concerns, and thoughts, which are great for how we should be improving the carbon removal field. Through working closely with these organizations, we were able to have deep conversations regarding the concerns associated with certain carbon removal projects. And before I talk about those concerns, I always like to point out that Carbon 180 is not an environmental justice organization. So for us, it has always been important that as we do our carbon removal work, to highlight the voices and concerns of those that will be actually having these projects in their community. And we want to make sure that those being directly impacted or receiving the direct benefits from these projects are basically given a voice to say, these are things that I don't like about projects, and these are things that we should maybe consider when we are incorporating carbon removal projects. So these are some of the concerns they have raised over the past 3 years that I've had an opportunity to work with them. Some general carbon removal concerns we have gotten thus far are around transparency and information available. One of the questions we get often is there enough information regarding a certain project to say it will work and no harm will be done? Another big point we've gotten around transparency is the government and developers should be doing more to provide us information so that we feel like we know what's going on. From a tech-based side, we have heard communities raise concerns about the location of facilities. Carbon removal projects might be disproportionately located in marginalized communities, further burdening them with environmental impacts. So for these environmental justice organizations, it is concerning to know where these facilities are going to be located. Something else that they've raised issues around is the lack of community engagement. Not having sufficient input into the development and siting of carbon removal projects often leads to mistrust and potential negative impact on local communities. And then, of course, there are health risks. Communities would love to have a better understanding of both primary and secondary risk associated with tech-based projects. And then perpetuating fossil fuel reliance. Oftentimes, when we are talking with EJ organizations and communities, the first thing they say is carbon removal could potentially fuel the oil and gas industry and could make us depend on fossil fuel reliance even more. Of course, there is the issue around water usage and energy usage. We know that the direct air capture facilities will require significant energy to operate, and this is raising concerns about increased emissions if not powered by renewable energy sources. And then there's the big issue, which will be discussed later, around transportation and storage. The risk of captured carbon dioxide escaping back into the atmosphere from underground storage, potentially contaminating groundwater or triggering seismic activity, is a major worry, especially when considering the scale of carbon removal needed to combat the climate change. And then when we switch over to the land-based side, some of the concerns and issues or questions we're getting are around permanence. They're saying like, it's hard to maintain these efforts to keep it stored. And from the forestry perspective, the maintenance is increasing as the climate change or extreme weathers are increasing. So these are all things that I want to acknowledge and raise from some of the community organizations we are working with. Of course, this list is not the final list, but these are some of the important things and recurring things we have been hearing. So at Carbon 180, it doesn't just end with us acknowledging those concerns. We use that information to try to either answer those questions and concerns internally or find the resources available to make sure communities have a platform to raise awareness. Some ways in which we think these concerns can be addressed are through meaningful community engagement. And by meaningful, I mean having dialogue between the developers and the government agencies. Of course, there is research and development, and then strict regulations. So as we continue our regranting work, we are hopeful that we can create a CDR field that centers equity and justice and simply puts community first. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Elena. Really appreciate you sharing all of that really valuable info. And we would have been going now to Jack Willingham, who is Mississippi's Emergency Management Agency, who works for the Mississippi Emergency Management Agency, but he at the last minute was not able to come, unfortunately. So in his absence, I just want to share a few of the articles and really quickly talk about what happened in Satartia, Mississippi before we go to our next speaker. So first I'll drop just a few helpful articles. I really recommend you save these and take a look. I'm also going to drop an article that's actually from one of the organizations we have a speaker here with today. So what happened in Satartia, Mississippi was a CO2 pipeline that was transporting CO2 from actually a carbon capture and storage project was going through the city of Satartia in Mississippi. This is a small town. It's majority Black town, and it was a place where the CO2 pipeline actually exploded, and it caused cars to stop working because CO2 it sort of doesn't allow cars to work, and it can suffocate you. It's an asphyxiant. And so people were, having like being disoriented and like foaming at the mouth and just like really horrible things. A lot of people were hospitalized, and the company that was responsible sort of, forced people to sign something that said, you're basically signing your rights away if we pay for your, emergency hospital visit. So really a scary thing, something that everyone should really be aware of. And we are hoping that we can hear from Jack in another place, and definitely really recommend that you all save these articles if you haven't already read about what happened. And it is a really important lesson that we all should be really understanding and considering as other states are looking at transporting CO2 from whether it's carbon capture or direct air capture technological projects. So with that, I want to introduce our next speaker, who is from Kern County, Ileana Navarro with the Central California Environmental Justice Network. Welcome, Ileana.
Hi, everyone. Ileana here. Let me just pull up my slides. But thank you all so much for having me. Okay, 1 second. Oh, there we are. Okay, I'm so sorry. This is my first time being in a webinar like this, so please bear with me. Okay, here we go. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me again. And like I was introduced, my name is Ileana. I am a community organizer and air quality specialist with the Central California Environmental Justice Network. And today I'm going to be sharing a little bit about our experience working in Kern County with projects that are being proposed for carbon capture and sequestration. And so to start, I want to just begin by explaining who the community that we work with is. We work with communities in Benwillow, Lost Hills, Shafter, and Arvin. These are Latino, farmworker, low-income families living in rural areas of Kern County. Both Buttonwillow and Lost Hills are unincorporated towns of Kern, and Shafter and Arvin are both AB 617 communities that were selected because of they are the most impacted by by air pollution in the valley. And as most of you may know, the Central Valley as a whole is the area most impacted by air pollution when it comes to particulate matter. And this largely stems from the high production of oil and gas and agricultural areas. And so I'd also like to do a quick overview of the two projects that we are currently engaging in. These are not the only projects proposed in the California Central Valley for CCS, but these are the ones that we have been engaging residents in. And these are the Carbon TerraVault 1 or CCV1 CCS project and the Carbon Frontier CCS project. And both of these projects are being proposed by an oil and gas company, and they would both be located in an oil field. Carbon TerraVault 1 is proposing to capture and store 1.46 million tons of CO2 over the next 26 years, using an on-site gas plant and possible direct air capture and other sources in the future. It is proposing to have a 13.2 miles of carbon dioxide pipelines and 6 Class 6 injection wells. Carbon Frontier, on the other end, is proposing to capture and store 3.3 million tons of carbon dioxide per year for 20 years using an on-site gas plant and a steam generator with other possibilities of other sources in the future, as well as 14.5 miles of carbon dioxide pipelines and 9 Class 6 injection wells. And so the community outreach that these two companies have focused on has been the amount of jobs that these projects will bring to community members. And these jobs will bring a max of 10 full-time jobs for each project. No long-term jobs, and these jobs would require specific skills that community members that we work with don't have. There has been little to no education on CCS technology and the health impacts. And one of the companies has actually released a community benefits plan that seems to only include special districts and no genuine representation of community members and no real benefits for communities. Another concern, like as mentioned before, is the proximity to vulnerable communities. Carbon TerraVault 1 is proposing to be located 2.5 miles from McKittrick Elementary School and 8 miles from the community of Buttonwillow. And to kind of see a little bit of where these two communities are located um, in proximity to the project, you can see there's also agricultural fields surrounding the project site that our communities or our farmer communities work in on a daily basis. And then Carbon Frontier would be 7 miles from Lost Hills. 28 homes would be 3.5 miles from the project site, and this is including 3 schools within 7 to 8 miles. And then I added a little bit to this map obtained from the draft environmental impact report to show both projects and how and the proximity to both of these. And you can see it's a little alarming to see the whole west side of these communities just covered in stored carbon dioxide or proposed stored carbon dioxide. Another big concern was the 28 miles of the carbon dioxide pipelines in an excerpt from the draft environmental impact report for Carbon Frontier CCS project. The report states that public personnel working in the area may be exposed to a concentration of CO2 greater than 4%, which may result in fatalities. This is extremely alarming for us to see in an environmental impact report. And why I decided to include it here. And like I said, this is not just including the workers on site or the workers in the wonderful farm solar panel, but also the farm working communities working in the agricultural fields. And then something to note that these projects would require 157 abandoned oil and gas wells, as well as 40 operational oil and gas wells to be plugged for both projects. The 2 yellow circles are 2 projects, and then you can see Buttonwillow and McKittrick next to these project sites. And as you can see, there are many more holes than 157 and 40 in the ground, and our concern is just how can we ensure that these wells won't serve as straws for the carbon dioxide to sneak back into the atmosphere. And it's just really alarming to see this amount of oil and gas wells with such a proximity to vulnerable communities. And lastly, I wanted to emphasize the lack of trust in oil and gas companies. The company CRC that is proposing Carbon TerraVault 1 has an unreliable record on emission control. According to the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, or Cal OES, 113 confirmed spills and leaks from CRC infrastructure have occurred since 2014. 2 examples of that from this year are on June 11th and June 17th, where 5,460 gallons of oil water mixture spilled, and a pipeline failed and 84 gallons of crude oil spilled into a waterway. This year alone, 36 OES reports on behalf of CRC have been reported, with over 1,600 barrels released. Residents that have lived in these communities near these oil wells and near these oil fields have experienced a lack of just regulation on behalf of these oil and gas companies. Companies don't take public health seriously. Their monitoring and plugging of wells aren't properly executed. And these communities are just kind of tired of seeing this, and they want to see something that will actually benefit them. This is really dangerous for these companies to continue to pollute, and these communities don't trust them to execute CCS safely. And that is all for my presentation. Thank you all so much for having me and listening to everything I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ileana. I want to, before we go to the next speaker, just clarify, we heard from Ileana about some carbon capture and storage projects in the region that Ileana's organization works, CCEJN works in, and just differentiating the carbon capture and storage from the carbon dioxide removal. But that transportation and storage is largely going to be similar issues because the CO2 still has to be transported and stored somewhere with some of the technological side of carbon dioxide removal. So still very relevant. I just want to make that clarification. And thank you so much, Ileana. Really appreciate you. Okay, well, we are going to go now to, I think our next speaker is Amanda. Curious if your internet is all situated and you're good. Okay, great. We're now going to hear from Amanda McKay with the Pipeline Safety Trust. Thank you so much, Amanda.
And let me just get my screen shared here. All right. Great. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this webinar. I think it's a really important conversation to be had. And just like what Melissa just said, when you think about all these different projects that have to do with CCS or carbon dioxide removal, or even the hydrogen hubs, we don't want to open that can of worms, but they all are going to require some amount of pipelines to move the commodity from wherever it's being produced or captured to wherever it's being used or stored and or sequestered. And so just thinking about the importance of the transportation safety aspects is really really important. So my name is Amanda McKay. I am the policy manager with the Pipeline Safety Trust. We are a nonprofit watchdog organization for the oil and gas pipeline industry. We were formed in the aftermath of a pipeline tragedy here in Bellingham, Washington, which is where I'm based, in which a pipeline, gasoline pipeline ruptured in our community, spilled over 250,000 gallons of gasoline into a local creek. And that gasoline eventually ignited and killed 3 boys in our community. Many people had no idea that there was a pipeline running through our community. The city of Bellingham had essentially forgotten that there was a franchise agreement with this pipeline, and it wrecked our community. And the families of those 3 boys really stood up and brought the community together to try and figure out what went wrong, what happened, and also to ensure that this didn't happen to any other community. And so the Pipeline Safety Trust was formed with the settlement money from the case prosecuting the pipeline operator. In this case, it was Olympic Pipeline. And so we, for the past 25 years or so, have been really living off of that settlement money. And we have really focused in the past on traditional oil and gas pipelines, natural gas, petroleum liquids, things like that. But in the last couple of years, there's been a big shift in thinking about these newer commodities that run through pipelines. And so just to go into a little bit of history about CO2 pipelines specifically, in 1986, there was a natural CO2 release from Lake Nyos in Cameroon, and it killed over 1,000 people just due to CO2 asphyxiation. And after that tragedy, PHMSA, which is the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, the federal regulator that oversees pipeline regulations, said, that's concerning. We need to do something. And so they wrote CO2 into the regulations. However, they really just added "and CO2" onto the hazardous liquid regulations. And so there wasn't really much specific to CO2 pipelines that was added to those regulations. It really just encompassed CO2. And then, of course, in 2020, there was a pipeline in Satarsha, Mississippi, operated by Denbury, that ruptured. And that CO2 traveled from the rupture site almost 2 miles to the town of Satartia. Over, around 45 people were sent to the hospital. There was asphyxiation. Some of those people are still having health concerns to this day. And so that really woke us up to the concerns and dangers around CO2 pipelines. Along with Satartia, there was in 2021 the 45Q tax credit expansion. Then we saw the Inflation Reduction Act, some of these incentivizing mechanisms for this possible increased build out. In 2022, California enacted SB 905, which put a partial moratorium on CO2 pipelines in California. And that with the caveat that the federal regulation, the PHMSA was working on some federal regulations. And so putting a pause on new pipelines until those came out. PHMSA did hold a public meeting in Iowa where there are some CO2 pipeline projects being proposed. I think that was a really beneficial public meeting. I think that PHMSA got a lot out of it. I think the community learned a lot. And so that was a great next step. And then in just this year, PHMSA did announce a notice of proposed rulemaking for CO2 pipelines. They are working on that. It has not been published yet. And so we are expecting that to come out in the near future, but it's really hard to say when exactly that's going to come out. So on the right hand of the screen, you can see a photo from the Satartia incident, the crater that it created, and the white around it is from the dry ice created by the CO2. Down at the bottom of the screen, we did a comparison of existing CO2 pipeline mileage as compared to what is proposed with this possible increased build out, and then also how that compares to existing mileage of hazardous liquid pipelines. And I think it really shows that there's a lack of experience in the industry working with CO2 pipelines. And that's definitely really concerning when you think about the regulation gaps that we're seeing. Let's see, I kind of went over this a little bit, but like I said, prior to 2020, 2021, CO2 pipelines were really kind of off of our radar. Then, of course, the Satartia incident happened. There was a really amazing article by Dan Ziegart in the Huffington Post about the incident. I encourage those of you who haven't read it to go read it. And then we have some of these other incentives that have been happening. And so really just making this a top priority for our organization to ensure that that if these pipelines are going to be running through our communities, that they're safe and that they're well regulated. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the really technical concerns that we're seeing. So thinking about the federal regulation definition of CO2 is 90% CO2 in a supercritical state. And that's concerning because when you think about supercritical fluid CO2, it needs to be very highly pressurized and kept at a relatively high temperature as well. And so considering that is the definition of CO2 in the federal regulations, we worry that if a pipeline isn't operating within those parameters, there could be an argument that it's not regulated. And so we are pushing for having all phases of CO2 transport regulated, both federal and state, just to really cover the potential for phase changes within the pipe. Another concern that we have, of course, is that CO2 is odorless. It's not required to be odorized. It's colorless, and it is an asphyxiant. And so if there is a rupture, it's going to be really difficult to identify if you're potentially in danger. Another concern that we have is this unique fracture propagation potential. So in the event of a possible pipeline rupture, this highly pressurized CO2 will undergo some pretty rapid phase changes. And that increases the possibility of fracture propagation, where the pipeline can open up almost like a zipper and release a lot more carbon dioxide in a smaller amount of time, which can be really dangerous as well. Another issue that we're seeing is just this insufficient plume dispersion modeling process. So figuring out that when a CO2 pipeline ruptures, where does that CO2 go? And we found in the event of Satartia that the town of Satartia had not been identified as a possible area of impacted community. And that's due to insufficient plume dispersion modeling. And so we want to see that plume dispersion modeling be a lot more restrictive and also just taking into account communities in the area. Another thing I'll talk about is just contaminants within the CO2 pipeline stream. These can be really concerning and have potential causes of corrosion within the pipe. And one of the major concerns is water within a CO2 stream. Water and CO2 can combine and form carbonic acid, which is incredibly corrosive to steel. And so ensuring that we have safeguards in place for contaminant levels is incredibly important as well. Let's see. So talking about PHMSA's response to Satartia, there was an accident investigation report. There was a fine on Denbury, the operator. There's this new rulemaking that is in progress. We're still waiting to see what is exactly in it, but we all know that the rulemaking process takes a very long time, especially at the federal level. And then there are definitely quite a few research and development projects in the works. Challenges ahead. There is no congressional mandate for PHMSA to do this CO2 rulemaking, so that kind of limits the strength necessarily. Federal rulemaking can take years. And then there's some statutory limitations as well. When you think about pipelines, the design and construction regulations, there's statutory limitations on new regulations retroactively applying to existing pipelines. And so we really need these regulations to be strong and in place before a lot of these projects are getting built out. This was already talked about a little bit, but we do have concerns around CO2 pipelines running through environmental justice communities. It often puts a disproportionate burden on those communities, and there's definitely routing and siting issues regarding, which communities are easier to route pipelines through. So that's a major concern of ours as well. So closing it out, there's lots of research and development projects happening. We need to close these regulatory gaps through either federal and/or state level regulations. We have thoughts about, how states can go further than the potential federal regulations. And so I think that's really an opportunity for California to get out ahead and create these stronger safety regulations than what we have at the federal level as of right now. So happy to talk more about that and happy to answer questions. But thank you so much for allowing me to be here today.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Definitely encourage you all to check out Pipeline Safety Trust. They're a great resource. So I want to remind everyone to put their questions in the Q&A feature in the Zoom before we go to our next speaker. And our next speaker is Dr. Jens Burkholzer. So welcome, Dr. Jens.
I assume you can see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you. I want to thank you all for having me here. I'm a senior scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I've been there for a few decades and working on subsurface energy, geology, hydrogeology, things like geothermal, and also geologic carbon sequestration. So I'm happy to talk about this. Will be very high level because there's not a lot of time, and I'm hoping to get a lot of questions. And I'm happy to answer any questions even after this event. So let me just start and give you sort of the big picture rundown for those that are not totally familiar with the process. So the process of storing carbon geologically is really, we're taking this supercritical pressurized CO2 and place it back in the deep subsurface with reservoir geology that will allow it, to, ideally at least, to remain safely and permanently stored. So in some sense, we're taking that CO2 back into the geology or into the deep earth where carbons, at least in the form of oil and gas, initially came from. People ask often how much CO2 would have to be sequestered underground, and that really depends quite a bit on the, who you ask in terms of planning for climate mitigation. But just if we think about the 53 billion metric tons that we have been emitting in terms of greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide equivalent to 2023, there are studies that suggest that a few gigatons of CO2 would have to be sequestered as one of the portfolio of climate mitigation. And that could be CO2, I think it was discussed earlier, that is removed from the atmosphere. So that is carbon removal, or it is CO2 that would be captured from major emission sources. So these are like large power plants that should be decarbonized, or how to decarbonize industrial processes, things like that. So CO2 is injected deep underground, and particularly it must be injected deeper than 800 meters, because that's where the subsurface pressures are high enough that the CO2 stays supercritical. Means it's almost as dense as water. And that means that the storage can be done at much greater volumes if we were injecting as a gas. So typically you have that CO2 at least 1,000 meters, maybe 2,000 meters deep. And then what we're looking for is that slightly buoyant CO2 is kept from migrating back to the surface by suitable storage with multiple storage mechanisms. Most important is the geology, so really look at that. We often have structures in the subsurface, sedimentary structures that have impermeable rock layers. And so those would be used as seals above the storage formation where we inject. So the CO2 would be prevented from moving upward. There are other trapping mechanisms over a very long time scales. The ultimate one would be, we call it mineral trapping, because CO2 reacts with the formation rocks and it becomes a solid mineral. Is carbon sequestration already done? Yes, it is, and I'll give you some examples of where the world stays today. There are lots of projects already occurring. There are many more projects in construction or in development stages. So here I'm showing kind of how this would look like. So you see here a cross section from the surface to sort of a few kilometers deep. And as I mentioned before, we often have these sedimentary systems, and there's often layers that are quite permeable, like sandstones. And then we have these seals in between, primary seal, secondary seal. And so what we do is we inject that CO2 into these permeable systems, and then have the seals, the impermeable layers above them to protect them from that CO2 from moving upwards. So really what it does then, it migrates sideways and then forms sort of a plume that displaces the water that is down there. What we are concerned about, of course, is that CO2 might come back up. And there is a possibility that if those seals are not perfect, let's say there is a permeable fault there, or maybe there's an abandoned well, some of that CO2 could in fact migrate upward. And then that could cause harm possibly to groundwater. So here's an aquifer, a freshwater aquifer, or it could go back to the atmosphere. And of course, we want to avoid that. We need to make sure that that doesn't happen. Or if some part of CO2 migrates upwards, it needs to be very little in order to not cause harm. I should point out there's a lot of space between these deep storage formations and these surficial layers here. The waters down here are not usable. They're usually very salty, sort of highly contaminated with natural contaminants. So there is where we inject, there's not potable or in any ways usable water, and then there's a typically large distance to these freshwater aquifers. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about what is already happening in the world in terms of carbon capture removal and also geologic sequestration, particularly the latter. So if you look at the right, really project development around this has surged over the past 7 years or so, from maybe 60 million tons to like 400. And these are projects that are either built or they're in various development stages. And you can see the same here up in the center with a map of Canada and the US. Operational projects are in dark, and then the other ones are again in development stages. And then we can focus on this cluster here in California. And I hope you can see that this is the sort of Bay Area of the Delta, and down here is the Central Valley, the southern San Joaquin. These are projects that are currently geologic sequestration project regulatory review. We distinguish between what's called saline formations. So these are porous formations that I showed earlier. They're filled with brine or salty water, and there's a huge subsurface potential. They have not seen oil and gas development before. So you see some of these up here. And then there's also the possibility of injecting in what we call depleted oil and gas. So that's where oil and gas has played. The oil and gas has been extracted, and that leaves pore volume that can be filled with CO2. That's in some sense a good thing because the pressure buildup is less, but you do have, and Eliana alluded to that earlier, you do have a lot of wells that could potentially be leakage pathways. Now, again, going into California a little bit and looking at the geology, so you can see that in green, what is good geology where CO2 sequestration could take place safely. And largely the Central Valley is a very good place. It has very deep sediments up to thousands of meters with permeable and impermeable formation, as said before. You can also see some of the major emission sources where capture could happen. And we already learned about transportation. So ideally, you would have these capture sources nearby where your geology is best. I get asked often if industrial scale sequestration is already done. And the answer is yes. I said that before. Here's one example. This is, in fact, the very first large-scale project that was ever done in Norway. It has, since 1996, injected 1 million tons of CO2 per year without any safety concerns. The project was also quite successful in that it showed that we have monitoring tools. In this case, this is sort of, we call it tomographic modeling with seismic, tools that you could see where the CO2 actually migrated laterally under the seal. So this is time-lapse seismic. So you have early project phases, and then you can show that the plume grows as it was expected. This is a plan view, and you can see the same in a cross section. So we have tools in place to showcase where CO2 goes. I want to talk about risk and guardrails. In terms of risk, I'll focus on CO2 leakage, which is often a concern, and also the induced seismicity that was mentioned earlier. I haven't explained what the latter is. So when you inject fluids of any type into the subsurface and you have pressure increases, those pressure increases could also increase within nearby faults. And if you have faults that are earthquake prone, that pressure increase could actually trigger earthquakes. These are often very, very small and can never be felt, but they could in theory, and sometimes that happened in other fields outside of CO2 sequestration, could lead to somewhat sizable earthquakes. And of course, we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. So there is the regulatory framework. It's EPA's, the Environmental Protection Agency's Class 6 framework. And so what it does is, very, very briefly, it looks at the projected expected footprint of where in the deep subsurface of CO2 would ever migrate to. And it also looks at the area where pressure increases in the deep subsurface where the injection happens are above a certain threshold. And oops, I'm sorry for that. If any of that then is seen and expected, then this is called the so-called area of review. So you would look at the potential size of a project deep underground, and then in that area, the EPA asks for a detailed characterization of geology and potential pathways. It asks for monitoring, it asks for risk assessment studies, and it also asks for, they call it corrective action. So let's say you find a well, and an old well that could potentially be a pathway. It has to be looked at, and then in case there is a concern, it would have to be recompleted or replugged, as we call it. Maybe a little more detail in terms of managing the risk of CO2 leakage. So what needs to be done is that you do actions prior to a project start, and you do actions during and after injection. Prior to the project start, as I mentioned, you need to find and characterize any potential leakage pathways, do corrective action, do risk assessment. If the project is permitted to go forward, you will do two things. You look at the performance monitoring and the storage formation itself. So where is that CO2 going? And you compare that with the predictions. And if necessary, you have to increase the size of the area of review and things like that. And you do, excuse me again, oops, where are we? You do assurance monitoring. So you would have sensors in the sediments above the storage formation to see if there could be any leakage. You would look at freshwater impacts and with sensors. You would look at potential leakage at the ground surface. I would say there's also research done. My own lab did some sort of what if CO2 was leaking into groundwater studies. We in fact did a field study. You see that on the bottom left, where we injected CO2 deliberately into groundwater. CO2 itself isn't toxic in water, but it could change acidity, and that could release contaminants. We were able to show in this particular case, at least, that the impact was very short-lived and it never changed water quality above the groundwater standards in this particular case, though. Finally, managing induced seismicity. Again, there are measures one takes before the project start. We're looking for large faults that could potentially be a concern. If that happens, the project shouldn't go forward. We're looking at risk assessment. If the risk seems too high, the project shouldn't go forward. And then we develop risk management plans, which would be in place if a project goes forward. And then during and after injection, you would essentially do monitoring-based risk measures and do activities in real time. So you have a seismic monitoring network that picks up very small microseismicity. If anything seems abnormal, you have predefined risk mitigation measures, such as, for example, stopping the project or stopping injection and seeing that there is no concerns. So with that, I would like to stop and see if there's any questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Super interesting. So we are going to now switch over to audience Q&A. So if I could have my all the speakers come back on camera, I'm going to start with a question that was directed at Elena. And this is a question: are there documents or resources that can be useful with recommendations for policymakers for carbon dioxide removal and also carbon capture and storage projects?
Oh, is that Elena or Eliana?
Elena, sorry.
Okay, so me. Yes, we do have some documents available for how we are encouraging policymakers to think about carbon removal. To be clear, Carbon 180 does not focus on carbon capture. And the documents that we have available that focus on carbon removal center equity and justice, which I can share in the chat or will be a follow-up in an email. But a great example of one is our Removing Forward document that places an emphasis on making sure that community voices help inform policies. And we have a set of principles to guide policymakers as they develop carbon removal policies. And I'll be sure to share that information.
Awesome. Okay, the second question is for you, Ileana. The question is, are communities having any success in pushing back on these plans that you talked about?
Yeah, so a project that I didn't talk about was a biomass plant with CCS technology attached that was proposed in the city of McFarland, also in the Central Valley. And that project was canceled last year, at the end of the year, I believe. And this was due to community pushback, but also organizations working together to bring out the concerns and the mistakes in their environmental impact reports.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, the next audience question is for Amanda. So does your organization have a list of recommendations or safeguards that you could share to protect communities from pipelines?
Yeah, that's a great question. We do have a whole page on our website dedicated to CO2 pipeline safety, and it has a lot of resources on it. As of right now, the document that we have that I'll point you all to is our summary for policymakers. It goes over a lot of what I covered in my presentation, but at the end, it does have some recommendations. These recommendations were, when we created it, focused more on the federal regulator, but I think they're still applicable to the state of California as well. I think we've also been working on, thinking about what the federal regulations might look like and preparing for if they don't go far enough. And so we've been putting together some information about how California and other states can better prepare themselves to put forth some regulations that are more stringent than what we might see out of the federal regulations that are forthcoming. Those aren't up on our website yet, but if anyone wants to chat about some of those, more than happy to talk to anyone who wants to reach out to me and talk about those. And hopefully we'll have them up soon.
Awesome. That's a great resource. There's another question for you, Amanda, and that is that we understand there was another gas involved in the Satarsha pipeline explosion. Can you say a little more about that so that it doesn't happen again?
Sure, yeah, I can talk a little bit about, I think that we're talking about the presence of hydrogen sulfide in the CO2 stream in the pipeline that ruptured outside of Satartia. It is true that there was hydrogen sulfide. It was naturally occurring in the source that Denbury got their CO2 from in order to do enhanced oil recovery. I think one thing to point out is, yes, hydrogen sulfide is absolutely toxic, but so is CO2. It's an asphyxiant. It causes health concerns, asphyxiation, things like that. And so the combination of the two was absolutely an issue. I think something that I didn't get to touch on too much is just thinking about the different sources of CO2. You have these naturally occurring sources that pipeline operators are pulling from to do enhanced oil recovery, as Denbury was. But then you also have to think about some of these anthropogenic sources that might have additional contaminants that are concerning as well, thinking about NOx and SOx and water as well, like I said in my presentation. So, it's not, contaminants are going to be a concern regardless of the source, and they are corrosive and it does compromise the integrity of the pipe. So definitely something to keep in mind regardless of the source of the CO2.
Thanks, Amanda. Okay, and Jens, we have a few questions for you. The first one I will start with is Dr. Burkholzer familiar with the legacy and costs of orphan and abandoned oil wells across the US and California? What regulatory program would be necessary to ensure CO2 sequestration is both monitored and paid for by industry and not falling on the public and community's health long term? And there's also a request to discuss ADM's CO2 well leakage.
Sounds like I will speak the next 20 minutes. Yeah, I'm very familiar with the legacy costs or legacy and costs of orphan and abandoned oil and gas wells. There is so we had oil and gas industry in this country operating for at least 100, maybe more years. And while this has not happened lately, the early years and decades were definitely years and decades where wells weren't abandoned to today's standards, of course, and the record keeping isn't there. So there are, in fact, wells across this country of the hundreds and thousands we have that are undocumented. They may not be known they exist, and they may not be properly plugged. And so there's a major program that the US is running right now with infrastructure dollars to find these and then to do remedial action, because it is a huge concern for methane, for example, losses and other things, and could be concern for CO2 sequestration as well. This shouldn't happen anymore. So we're looking mostly at old wells. CO2 projects would be required to pay for the monitoring and corrective action within the area of review. So it's not something that the government would have to pay for. Sometimes people ask, how long is monitoring continuing after the project ends? And the current requirement is 50 years by EPA. Assuming that by then the CO2 has actually been fully trapped and isn't migrating anymore. That, of course, is yet to be seen, I would say. Some states have programs where they take over liability after the project has ended, after the company isn't responsible anymore after these 50 years. So I think that is important, that there's long-term liability in place for sure. So talking about ADM CO2 well leakage, for those that don't know what happened, and I only know what happened from reading about it, I'm not involved in any ways. ADM is a project in a CO2 sequestration project in Illinois. I think it's been operating since 2017 or so. I think injecting about 1 million tons per year, so it's sizable. I think some months ago, EPA or ADM discovered that CO2 had leaked through a well into the next overlying deep saline formation, still about 5,000 feet deep. Some CO2 had leaked. What we do seem to know is that it leaked through a monitoring well. And in fact, what I think happened is that this well, in fact, was put in place to do something really nice, at least as a scientist for me, really nice. It was supposed to take water samples in the reservoir, in the seal, and then in the overlying deep reservoir to see if there's any changes, if any CO2 could leak. And the tool that they used was a very modern new tool, but in the end, it turned out to be not a very good tool. It corroded a bit. And so some CO2, I think a few thousand tons or so, went into the next overlying unit. I think it's still being looked at what and why exactly it happened. I think the good news is that there's still 2 or 3 seals and still 5,000 feet or so of rocks before you hit a major groundwater resource. So it's still deep in the subsurface, but that's the Decatur project, or the ADM project.
Thank you for that. Before I go to the rest of the audience questions, I wanted to just ask all the speakers here, now that you've heard from each other, do you have any questions for other speakers?
I do for Jens, but they're all in the chat. So I'm more excited to hear about
Okay.
yeah, what's going on there.
Okay, we can go on to the next questions. And Jens, these are also for you. There were a few questions that were directed at you. One question is, once the CO2 becomes a solid mineral, how does that affect P and S wave velocities, the severity of earthquakes, and our ability to predict earthquakes?
Oh, that's a good, very good, deep technical question. Nice question. Yeah. So I think I would say the easiest answer for me is that typically the earthquakes we're concerned about are not happening within the reservoirs where we inject CO2. So the earthquakes we're concerned about are in the deeper basement rocks mostly. The CO2 doesn't really touch those rocks. So in that sense, I think even if there were changes in the geomechanical structure of the rocks, if CO2 becomes a solid mineral, then they wouldn't affect prediction of deeper earthquakes. It's an interesting research project. I don't think I've ever heard that that this small sort of additional mineralization would change the properties of the rocks very much.
Very sciencey question.
I know.
Elena, there is a question for you. Then that is, can you speak to the community engagement requirements under Department of Energy's Direct Air Capture Hubs program?
Sure, I can speak a little bit about the community benefit plans that they have incorporated under the Direct Air Capture program. So the community benefit plans were created as a way to engage community more and to create community dialogue that was beyond like the minimum of having a public comment period. Within the community benefit plans, the applicant is required to do 4 things under the community portion of the application. They are supposed to look at workforce agreements. They are supposed to look at DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, I forgot the A, Justice 40, and I am forgetting one more. But within those four components, part of that is actually creating something like a community advisory council. Thank you, Diane, accessibility, EIA, the accessibility. So part of those requirements is also creating some type of community role to actually have those transparent conversations. So it can be something as simple as a community advisory council, a community board, and part of what DOE is asking of developers is to communicate early and often with communities so that when projects are being deployed, communities know what's going on, there's transparency, and communities have an opportunity to help shape the projects. Now, has that been going according to plan? No, everything is not perfect, and we realize that the government could have done a better job with the way that they streamrolled the process and the way that communities have are actually being engaged. So what is Carbon 180 doing? We are working with communities that are close to direct air capture hubs and telling them to advocate for what they want, allowing them. Yes, in the next webinar, we'll go into more detail on community benefit plans and oversight. But what we are seeing is that there is still this disconnect from community developers and government. And we are trying to find ways for communities to first have that educational knowledge for what even is carbon removal, what are these projects that are being deployed, so that they can go to the government and go to developers to hold them accountable and say, these are things that we want. We want to enter into legal binding documents that provide us with the benefits and not just the impacts associated with these communities. So that's, yeah, a little brief answer.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go to a question that is for all speakers. Who is responsible for monitoring leak detection and remediation? Is all of that process transparent? Who pays for it? And what are the penalties if leaks are not fixed?
Yeah, I can take a first stab at that because it is I think it is that related to geologic sequestration, or is it pipeline? I mean that I think is probably the question here. I send it to Amanda if for the pipeline part, but for the geologic sequestration part, it is the project or the permit applicant or the entity that runs the project needs to pay for monitoring, leak detection, and remediation within the realms of that defined space that could be affected by the CO2 project. Now there's the EPA, of course, needs to take a hard look at the monitoring plans or the leak detection that the companies put forward, because obviously monitoring costs money, right? And so you will want to make sure that it's done right, and there is no sort of there isn't an incentive for the companies to do it as cheap as they can.
Yeah, and I can take it from the pipeline perspective. It's often on the operators themselves to do the monitoring of their own pipelines, and how they monitor is directed by those federal regulations. And from our standpoint, they're not unique to CO2. The federal regulations are not unique to the unique risks of CO2. And we also have some major concerns about just the lack of leak detection technology specific to CO2 pipelines. We have some leak detection technology for natural gas pipelines, some for hazardous liquids as well, but CO2 is just such a unique commodity, and we talked a little bit about the different phases that it can run through a pipeline, and so we really need to be thinking about the lack of technology in leak detection as it relates to CO2 pipelines, and then who pays for it. like I said, it's often on the operator, but then once the leak happens, who knows? So I think that's really an up in the air question, and whether or not the operators are required to do enough as far as leak detection before it happens, but then also thinking about who pays for the emergency response equipment that emergency responders need, who pays for the training to deal with these pipeline emergencies. So all of those questions come into play and are still being figured out.
If I could add from a community perspective, I think we would like to see maybe like a third party monitoring just to ensure, like Jen said, that it's being done right and it's not the companies kind of giving themselves an A and not really getting like the like transparency and giving the public that benefit of the doubt.
Yeah,
It's a great idea.
makes sense. There's a follow-up question for all of you about how long does CO2 monitoring need to continue and who pays for this? There's a related comment and question in the chat about similar to this is like, what would the long-term cost of taxpayers be for maintaining and monitoring carbon injection sites after that period might be over, or if a corporation goes under? Can you all address that?
Yeah, I'm if it is again for geologic sequestration and deep subsurface, then the current requirement by EPA is that it should be another 50 years after the injection ends. There's a possibility that companies can make a case that it should be shorter if they can demonstrate that the CO2 isn't migrating anymore. So in other words, as you stop injecting, there is no driving force anymore for CO2 to migrate sideways within the reservoir. So the footprint doesn't become bigger. And I think I mentioned some of the trapping mechanisms in addition to the sort of the seals, the reactive chemistry comes in. So the CO2 really doesn't want to move anymore. If they can demonstrate that, then it's could be shorter than that. And then either some other entity needs to take on that's not the company for liability monitoring, or the project is supposed to be safe, and in that case, it would stop monitoring. That's the current regulatory environment, at least. And the companies pay for that 50 years.
Anyone else wants to add to that question of how long things need to be monitored?
I would
Okay.
think forever. I was just gonna say that I would think forever until, it's done, until the project is completed and no carbon dioxide is anywhere stored.
Yeah. Okay, well, that wraps up our audience Q&A portion and what we have time for. We are going to do a poll for everyone in the audience. So which topic areas discussed in today's webinar did you find the most helpful? And we'll see the live results once people fill it out. Okay. Now we see the results. Okay, so you can see here, just based on people in the audience, the topics that they found the most helpful. So that's super helpful to know. And I hope that you all will join us for the webinar coming up in January. The specific date is to be announced, but it'll be the part 2 on carbon dioxide removal in communities. And this next topic will be on oversight, governance, and community benefits. So any last remaining words of wisdom from any of our speakers as we say goodbye to our audience?
Maybe I just have a question. There's a lot of other really good questions in there that we didn't get to. Is there any process that we could answer some of those after the fact, or?
Yes, we will be saving and sharing out the chat.
Okay.
So we will have an opportunity for you all to see this afterwards, and we can figure out a way to get some of the answers to everyone's great questions. So thank you so much. And to California Environmental Voters, the Climate Center, and Project 2030. We're all co-hosting this webinar series together. Really appreciate everyone taking the time on a Friday morning to come and chat with us and learn with us. And thank you so much to all of our amazing speakers. We're super grateful to have you all here. You all brought a wealth of knowledge, and we're just really grateful that we got to hear what you had to say. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.